Chapter 1 of The Mysterious Stranger. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Mysterious Stranger and Other Stories by Mark Twain. Chapter 1. It was in 1590, winter. Austria was far away from the world and asleep. It was still the Middle Ages in Austria, and promised to remain so forever. Some even set it away back centuries upon centuries, and said that by the mental and spiritual clock it was still the age of belief in Austria. But they meant it as a compliment, not a slur, and it was so taken, and we were all proud of it. I remember it well, although I was only a boy, and I remember, too, the pleasure it gave me. Yes, Austria was far from the world and asleep, and our village was in the middle of that sleep, being in the middle of Austria. It drowsed in peace, in the deep privacy of a hilly and woodsy solitude, where news from the world hardly ever came to disturb its dreams, and was infinitely content. At its front flowed the tranquil river, its surface painted with cloud forms and the reflections of drifting arks and stone boats. Behind it rose the woody steeps to the base of the lofty precipice. From the top of the precipice frowned a vast castle, its long stretch of towers and bastions mailed in vines. Beyond the river, a league to the left, was a tumbled expanse of forest-clothed hills, cloven by winding gorges where the sun never penetrated, and to the right a precipice overlooked the river, and between it and the hills just spoken of lay a far-reaching plain dotted with little homesteads nested among orchards and shade-trees. The whole region for leagues around was the hereditary property of a prince, whose servants kept the castle always in perfect condition for occupancy. But neither he nor his family came there oftener than once in 5 years. When they came, it was as if the Lord of the world had arrived, and had brought all the glories of its kingdoms along, and when they went, they left a calm behind, which was like the deep sleep which follows an orgy. Esseldorf was a paradise for us boys. We were not overmuch pestered with schooling. Mainly, we were trained to be good Christians, to revere the Virgin, the Church, and the saints above everything. Beyond these matters we were not required to know much, and, in fact, not allowed to. Knowledge was not good for the common people, and could make them discontented with the lot which God had appointed for them, and God would not endure discontentment with his plans. We had 2 priests. One of them, Father Adolf, was a very zealous and strenuous priest, much considered. There may have been better priests, in some ways, than Father Adolf, but there was never one in our commune who was held in more solemn and awful respect. This was because he had absolutely no fear of the devil. He was the only Christian I have ever known of whom that could be truly said. People stood in deep dread of him on that account, for they thought that there must be something supernatural about him, else he could not be so bold and so confident. All men speak in bitter disapproval of the devil, but they do it reverently, not flippantly. But Father Adolf's way was very different. He called him by every name he could lay his tongue to, and it made everyone shudder that heard him, and often he would even speak of him scornfully and scoffingly. Then the people crossed themselves and went quickly out of his presence, fearing that something fearful might happen. Father Adolf had actually met Satan, face to face, more than once, and defied him. This was known to be so. Father Adolf said it himself. He never made any secret of it, but spoke it right out. And that he was speaking true there was proof in at least one instance, for on that occasion he quarreled with the enemy, and intrepidly threw his bottle at him, and there upon the wall of his study was the ruddy splotch where it struck and broke. But it was Father Peter, the other priest, that we all loved best and were sorriest for. Some people charged him with talking around in conversation that God was all goodness, and would find a way to save all his poor human children. It was a horrible thing to say, but there was never any absolute proof that Father Peter had said it, and it was out of character for him to say it, too, for he was always good and gentle and truthful. He wasn't charged with saying it in the pulpit, where all the congregation could hear and testify, but only outside, in talk, and it is easy for enemies to manufacture that. Father Peter had an enemy, and a very powerful one, the astrologer who lived in a tumbled old tower up the valley, and put in his nights studying the stars. Everyone knew he could foretell wars and famines, though that was not so hard, for there was always a war, and generally a famine somewhere. But he could also read any man's life through the stars in a big book he had, and find lost property, and everyone in the village except Father Peter stood in awe of him. Even Father Adolf, who had defied the devil, had a wholesome respect for the astrologer when he came through our village, wearing his tall pointed hat and his long flowing robe with stars on it, carrying his big book, and a staff which was known to have magic power. The bishop himself sometimes listened to the astrologer, it was said, for, besides studying the stars and prophesying, the astrologer made a great show of piety, which would impress the bishop, of course. But Father Peter took no stock in the astrologer. He denounced him openly as a charlatan, a fraud, with no valuable knowledge of any kind, or powers beyond those of an ordinary and rather inferior human being, which naturally made the astrologer hate Father Peter and wish to ruin him. It was the astrologer, as we all believed, who originated the story about Father Peter's shocking remark, and carried it to the bishop. It was said that Father Peter had made the remark to his niece Margaret, though Margaret denied it, and implored the bishop to believe her and spare her old uncle from poverty and disgrace. But the bishop wouldn't listen. He suspended Father Peter indefinitely, though he wouldn't go so far as to excommunicate him on the evidence of only one witness. And now Father Peter had been out a couple of years, and our other priest, Father Adolf, had his flock. Those had been hard years for the old priest and Margaret. They had been favorites, but of course that changed when they came under the shadow of the bishop's frown. Many of their friends fell away entirely, and the rest became cool and distant. Margaret was a lovely girl of 18 when the trouble came, and she had the best head in the village and the most in it. She taught the harp, and earned all her clothes and pocket money by her own industry. But her scholars fell off one by one now. She was forgotten when there were dances and parties among the youth of the village. The young fellows stopped coming to the house, all except Wilhelm Meidling, and he could have been spared. She and her uncle were sad and forlorn in their neglect and disgrace, and the sunshine was gone out of their lives. Matters went worse and worse all through the 2 years. Clothes were wearing out, bread was harder and harder to get, and now, at last, the very end was come. Solomon Isaacs had lent all the money he was willing to put on the house, and gave notice that tomorrow he would foreclose. End chapter 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. The Mysterious Stranger, chapter 1, read for you by Ted Delorme in Fort Mill, South Carolina, during March 2008. Chapter 2 of The Mysterious Stranger by Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Mysterious Stranger and Other Stories by Mark Twain. Chapter 2. 3 of us boys were always together, and had been so from the cradle, being fond of one another from the beginning, and this affection deepened as the years went on. Nicholas Baumann, son of the principal judge of the local court, Seppi Wohlmeyer, son of the keeper of the principal inn, the Golden Stag, which had a nice garden with shade trees reaching down to the riverside, and pleasure boats for hire. And I was the third, Theodore Fisher, son of the church organist, who was also the leader of the village musicians, teacher of the violin, composer, tax collector of the commune, sexton, and in other ways a useful citizen and respected by all. We knew the hills and the woods as well as the birds knew them, for we were always roaming them when we had leisure, at least when we were not swimming or boating or fishing or playing on the ice or sliding downhill. And we had the run of the castle park, and very few had that. It was because we were pets of the oldest serving man in the castle, Felix Brandt, and often we went there nights to hear him talk about old times and strange things, and to smoke with him, he taught us that, and to drink coffee, for he had served in the wars and was at the siege of Vienna. And there, when the Turks were defeated and driven away, among the captured things were bags of coffee, and the Turkish prisoners explained the character of it, and how to make a pleasant drink out of it. And now he always kept coffee by him, to drink himself, and also to astonish the ignorant with. When it stormed, he kept us all night. And while it thundered and lightened outside, he told us about ghosts and horrors of every kind, and of battles and murders and mutilations and such things, and made it pleasant and cozy inside. And he told these things from his own experience largely. He had seen many ghosts in his time, and witches and enchanters, and once he was lost in a fierce storm at midnight in the mountains, and by the glare of the lightning he had seen the wild huntsman rage on the blast, with his spectre dogs chasing after him through the driving cloud-rack. Also he had seen an incubus once, and several times he had seen the great bat that sucks the blood from the necks of people while they are asleep, fanning them softly with its wings, and so keeping them drowsy till they die. He encouraged us not to fear supernatural things, such as ghosts, and said they did no harm, but only wandered about because they were lonely and distressed, and wanted kindly notice and compassion. And in time we learned not to be afraid, and even went down with him in the night to the haunted chamber in the dungeons of the castle. The ghost appeared only once, and it went by very dim to the sight, and floated noiselessly through the air, and then disappeared. And we scarcely trembled, he had taught us so well. He said it came up sometimes in the night, and woke him by passing its clammy hand over his face, but it did him no hurt. It only wanted sympathy and notice. But the strangest thing was that he had seen angels, actual angels out of heaven, and had talked with them. They had no wings, and wore clothes, and talked and looked and acted just like any natural person, and you would never know them for angels, except for the wonderful things they did, which a mortal could not do, and the way they suddenly disappeared while you were talking with them, which was also a thing which no mortal could do. And he said they were pleasant and cheerful, not gloomy and melancholy like ghosts. It was after that kind of a talk one May night that we got up next morning and had a good breakfast with him, and then went down and crossed the bridge and went away up into the hills on the left to a woody hilltop, which was a favorite place of ours. And there we stretched out on the grass in the shade to rest and smoke and talk over these strange things, for they were in our minds yet and impressing us. But we couldn't smoke because we had been heedless and left our flint and steel behind. Soon there came a youth strolling toward us through the trees, and he sat down and began to talk in a friendly way, just as if he knew us. But we did not answer him, for he was a stranger, and we were not used to strangers and were shy of them. He had new and good clothes on, and was handsome, and had a winning face and a pleasant voice, and was easy and graceful and unembarrassed, not slouchy and awkward and diffident like other boys. We wanted to be friendly with him, but didn't know how to begin. Then I thought of the pipe, and wondered if it would be taken as kindly meant if I offered it to him. But I remembered that we had no fire, so I was sorry and disappointed. But he looked up bright and pleased, and said, "Fire? Oh, that is easy. I will furnish it." I was so astonished I couldn't speak, for I had not said anything. He took the pipe and blew his breath on it, and the tobacco glowed red, and spirals of blue smoke rose up. We jumped up and were going to run, for that was natural, and we did run a few steps, although he was yearningly pleading for us to stay, and giving us his word that he would not do us any harm, but only wanted to be friends with us and have company. So we stopped and stood, and wanted to go back, being full of curiosity and wonder, but afraid to venture. He went on coaxing, in his soft, persuasive way, and when we saw that the pipe did not blow up and nothing happened, our confidence returned by little and little, and presently our curiosity got to be stronger than our fear, and we ventured back, but slowly, and ready to fly at any alarm. He was bent on putting us at ease, and he had the right art. One could not remain doubtful and timorous where a person was so earnest and simple and gentle, and talked so alluringly as he did. No, he won us over, and it was not long before we were content and comfortable and chatty and glad we had found this new friend. When the feeling of constraint was all gone, we asked him how he had learned to do that strange thing, and he said he hadn't learned it at all. It came natural to him, like other things. Other curious things. What ones? Oh, a number. I don't know how many. Will you let us see you do them? Do, please, the others said. You won't run away again? No, indeed we won't. Please do, won't you? Yes, with pleasure. But you mustn't forget your promise, you know. We said we wouldn't, and he went to a puddle, and came back with water in a cup he had made out of a leaf, and blew upon it, and threw it out, and it was a lump of ice the shape of the cup. We were astonished and charmed, but not afraid any more. We were very glad to be there, and asked him to go on and do some more things. And he did. He said he would give us any kind of fruit we liked, whether it was in season or not. We all spoke at once. Orange, apple, grapes. They are in your pockets, he said. And it was true. And they were of the best, too, and we ate them and wished we had more, though none of us said so. You will find them where those came from, he said, and everything else your appetites call for. And you need not name the thing you wish. As long as I am with you, you have only to wish and find. And he said true. There was never anything so wonderful and so interesting. Bread, cakes, sweets, nuts, whatever one wanted, it was there. He ate nothing himself, but sat and chatted, and did one curious thing after another to amuse us. He made a tiny toy squirrel out of clay, and it ran up a tree, and sat on a limb overhead, and barked down at us. Then he made a dog that was not much larger than a mouse, and it treed the squirrel and danced about the tree, excited and barking, and was as alive as any dog could be. It frightened the squirrel from tree to tree, and followed it up until both were out of sight in the forest. He made birds out of clay, and set them free, and they flew away, singing. At last I made bold to ask him to tell us who he was. An angel, he said, quite simply, and set another bird free, and clapped his hands and made it fly away. A kind of awe fell upon us when we heard him say that, and we were afraid again. But he said we need not be troubled. There was no occasion for us to be afraid of an angel, and he liked us anyway. He went on chatting as simply and unaffectedly as ever, and while he talked he made a crowd of little men and women the size of your finger, and they went diligently to work and cleared and leveled off a space a couple of yards square in the grass, and began to build a cunning little castle in it, the The women mixing the mortar and carrying it up the scaffoldings in pails on their head, just as our workwomen have always done, and the men laying the courses of masonry. 500 of these toy people swarming briskly about and working diligently and wiping the sweat off their faces as natural as life. In the absorbing interest of watching those 500 little people make the castle grow step by step and course by course, and take shape and symmetry, that feeling and awe soon passed away, and we were quite comfortable and at home again. We asked if we might make some people, and he said yes, and told Seppi to make some cannon for the walls, and told Nicholas to make some halberdiers with breastplates and greaves and helmets, and I was to make some cavalry with horses. And in allotting these tasks he called us by our names, but did not say how he knew them. Then Seppi asked him what his own name was, and he said tranquilly, Satan, and held out a chip and caught a little woman on it who was falling from the scaffolding, and put her back where she belonged, and said, she is an idiot to step backward like that and not notice what she is about. It caught us suddenly, the name did, and our work dropped out of our hands and broke to pieces, a cannon, a halberdier, and a horse. Satan laughed, and asked what was the matter. I said, nothing, only it seemed a strange name for an angel. He asked why. Because well, it's his name, you know. Yes, he is my uncle. He said it placidly, but it took our breath for a moment, and made our hearts beat. He did not seem to notice that, but mended our halberdiers and things with a touch, handing them to us finished, and said, don't you remember? He was an angel himself once. Yes, it's true, said Seppi. I didn't think of that. Before the fall he was blameless. Yes, said Nicholas, he was without sin. It is a good family, ours, said Satan. There is not a better. He is the only member of it that has ever sinned. I should not be able to make anyone understand how exciting it all was. You know, that kind of quiver that trembles around through you when you are seeing something so strange and enchanting and wonderful that it is just a fearful joy to be alive and look at it. And you know how you gaze, and your lips turn dry, and your breath comes short, but you wouldn't be anywhere but there, not for the world. I was bursting to ask one question. I had it on my tongue's end, and could hardly hold it back, but I was ashamed to ask it. It might be a rudeness. Satan set an ox down that he had been making, and smiled up at me, and said, it wouldn't be a rudeness, and I should forgive it if it was. Have I seen him? Millions of times, from the time that I was a little child 1,000 years old. I was his second favorite among the nursery angels of our blood and lineage, to use a human phrase. Yes, from that time until the fall, 8,000 years, measured as you count time. 8,000? Yes, he turned to Seppi, and went on as if answering something that was in Seppi's mind. Why, naturally, I look like a boy, for that is what I am. With us, what you call time is a spacious thing. It takes a long stretch of it to grow an angel to full age. There was a question in my mind, and he turned to me and answered it. I am 16,000 years old, counting as you count. Then he turned to Nicholas and said, no, the fall did not affect me, nor the rest of the relationship. It was only he that I was named for who ate of the fruit of the tree, and then beguiled the man and the woman with it. We others are still ignorant of sin. We are not able to commit it. We are without blemish, and shall abide in that estate always. Two of the little workmen were quarreling, and in buzzing little bumblebee voices they were cursing and swearing at each other. Now came blows and blood. Then they locked themselves together in a life-and-death struggle. Satan reached out his hand and crushed the life out of them with his fingers, threw them away, wiped the red from his fingers on his handkerchief, and went on talking where he had left off. We cannot do wrong. neither have we any disposition to do it, for we do not know what it is." It seemed a strange speech in the circumstances, but we barely noticed that. We were so shocked and grieved at the wanton murder he had committed. For murder it was, that was its true name, and it was without palliation or excuse, for the men had not wronged him in any way. It made us miserable, for we loved him, and had thought him so noble and so beautiful and gracious, and had honestly believed he was an angel. And to have him do this cruel thing, it lowered him so, and we had had such pride in him. He went right on talking, just as if nothing had happened, telling about his travels and the interesting things he had seen in the big worlds of our solar systems, and of other solar systems far away in the remoteness of space, and about the customs of the immortals that inhabit them, somehow fascinating us, enchanting us, charming us, in spite of the pitiful scene that was now under our eyes, for the wives of the little dead men had found the crushed and shapeless bodies, and were crying over them, and sobbing and lamenting, and a priest was kneeling there with his hands crossed upon his breast, praying, and crowds of pitying friends were massed about them, reverently uncovered, with their bare heads bowed, and many with the tears running down. A scene which Satan paid no attention to until the small noise of the weeping and praying began to annoy him. Then he reached out and took the heavy board seat of our swing and brought it down, and mashed all those people into the earth just as if they had been flies, and went on talking just the same. An angel! And kill a priest! An angel who did not know how to do wrong, and yet destroys in cold blood hundreds of helpless poor men and women who had never done him any harm. It made us sick to see that awful deed, and to think that none of those poor creatures was prepared except the priest, for none of them had ever heard a mass or seen a church. And we were witnesses. We had seen these murders done, and it was our duty to tell and let the law take its course. But he went on talking right along, and worked his enchantments upon us again with that fatal music of his voice. He made us forget everything. We could only listen to him, and love him, and be his slaves, to do with as he would. He made us drunk with the joy of being with him, and of looking into the heaven of his eyes, and of feeling the ecstasy that thrilled along our veins from the touch of his hand. End Chapter 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. The Mysterious Stranger and Other Stories by Mark Twain. Read for you by Ted Delorme in Fort Mill, South Carolina, during March 2008. Chapter 3 of The Mysterious Stranger by Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Mysterious Stranger and Other Stories by Mark Twain. Chapter 3. The stranger had seen everything. He had been everywhere. He knew everything, and he forgot nothing. What another must study, he learned at a glance. There were no difficulties for him, and he made things live before you when he told about them. He saw the world made. He saw Adam created. He saw Samson surge against the pillars and bring the temple down in ruins about him. He saw Caesar's death. He told of the daily life in heaven. He had seen the damned writhing in the red waves of hell, and he made us see all these things. And it was as if we were on the spot and looking at them with our own eyes. And we felt them too, but there was no sign that they were anything to him beyond mere entertainments. Those visions of hell, those poor babes and women and girls and lads and men shrieking and supplicating in anguish. Why, we could hardly bear it, but he was as bland about it as if it had been so many imitation rats in an artificial fire. And always, when he was talking about men and women here on earth, and their doings, even their grandest and sublimest, we were secretly ashamed, for his manner showed that to him they and their doings were of paltry, poor consequence. Often you would think he was talking about flies, if you didn't know. Once he even said in so many words that our people down here were quite interesting to him, notwithstanding they were so dull and ignorant and trivial and conceited, and so diseased and rickety, and such a shabby, poor, worthless lot all around. He said it in a quite matter-of-course way, and without bitterness, just as a person might talk about bricks or manure or any other thing that was of no consequence and hadn't feelings. I could see he meant no offense, but in my thoughts I set it down as not very good manners. Manners, he said. Why, it is merely the truth, and truth is good manners. Manners are a fiction. The castle is done. Do you like it? Anyone would have been obliged to like it. It was lovely to look at. It was so shapely and fine, and so cunningly perfect in all its particulars, even to the little flags waving from the turrets. Satan said we must put the artillery in place now, and station the halberdiers, and display the cavalry. Our men and horses were a spectacle to see. They were so little like what they were intended for of course we had no art in making such things. Satan said they were the worst he had seen, and when he touched them and made them alive, it was just ridiculous the way they acted, on account of their legs not being of uniform lengths. They reeled and sprawled around as if they were drunk, and endangered everybody's lives around them, and finally fell over and lay helpless and kicking. It made us all laugh, though it was a shameful thing to see. The guns were charged with dirt to fire a salute, but they were so crooked and so badly made that they all burst when they went off, and killed some of the gunners and crippled the others. Satan said we would have a storm now, and an earthquake if we liked, but we must stand off a piece out of danger. We wanted to call the people away, too, but he said never mind them, they were of no consequence, and we could make more some time or other if we needed them. A small storm cloud began to settle down black over the castle, and the miniature lightning and thunder began to play, and the ground to quiver, and the wind to pipe and wheeze, and the rain to fall, and all the people flocked into the castle for shelter. The cloud settled down blacker and blacker, and one could see the castle only dimly through it. The lightning blazed out, flash upon flash, and pierced the castle, and set it on fire, and the flames shone out red and fierce through the cloud, and the people came flying out, shrieking, but Satan brushed them back, paying no attention to our begging and crying and imploring. And in the midst of the howling of the wind and volleying of the thunder, the magazine blew up. The earthquake rent the ground wide, and the castle's wreck and ruin tumbled into the chasm, which swallowed it from sight, and closed upon it, with all that innocent life, not one of the 500 poor creatures escaping. Our hearts were broken. We could not keep from crying. Don't cry, Satan said. They were of no value. But they are gone to hell. Oh, it is no matter. We can make plenty more. It was of no use to try to move him. Evidently he was wholly without feeling and could not understand. He was full of bubbling spirits, and as gay as if this were a wedding instead of a fiendish massacre, and he was bent on making us feel as he did, and of course his magic accomplished his desire. It was no trouble to him. He did whatever he pleased with us. In a little while we were dancing on that grave, and he was playing to us on a strange, sweet instrument, which he took out of his pocket. And the music, but there is no music like that, unless perhaps in heaven, and that was where he brought it from, he said. It made one mad for pleasure, and we could not take our eyes from him, and the look that went out of our eyes came from our hearts, and their dumb speech was worship. He brought the dance from heaven, too, and the bliss of paradise was in it. Presently he said he must go away on an errand, but we could not bear the thought of it, and clung to him, and pleaded with him to stay, and that pleased him, and he said so, and said he would not go yet, but would wait a little while, and we would sit down and talk a few minutes longer. And he told us Satan was only his real name, and he was to be known by it to us alone, but he had chosen another one to be called in the presence of others, just a common one, such as people have. Philip Traum. It sounded so odd and mean for such a being, but it was his decision, and we said nothing. His decision was sufficient. We had seen wonders this day, and my thoughts began to run on the pleasure it would be to tell them when I got home, but he noticed those thoughts and said, "No, all these matters are a secret among us four. I do not mind your trying to tell them if you like, but I will protect your tongues, and nothing of the secret will escape from them." It was a disappointment, but it couldn't be helped, and it cost us a sigh or two. We talked pleasantly along, and he was always reading our thoughts and responding to them, and it seemed to me that this was the most wonderful of all the things he did. But he interrupted my musings and said, "No, it would be wonderful for you, but it is not wonderful for me. I am not limited like you. I am not subject to human conditions. I can measure and understand your human weaknesses, for I have studied them, but I have none of them. My flesh is not real, although it would seem firm to your touch. My clothes are not real. I am a spirit." Father Peter is coming. We looked around, but did not see anyone. He is not in sight yet, but you will see him presently. "Do you know him, Satan?" "No." "Won't you talk with him when he comes? He is not ignorant and dull like us, and he would so like to talk with you. Will you?" "Another time, yes, but not now. I must go on my errand after a little. There he is now, you can see him. Sit still and don't say anything." We looked up and saw Father Peter approaching through the chestnuts. We three were sitting together in the grass, and Satan sat in front of us in the path. Father Peter came slowly along with his head down, thinking, and stopped within a couple yards of us, and took off his hat, and got out his silk handkerchief, and stood there mopping his face, and looking as if he were going to speak to us. But he didn't. Presently he muttered, "I can't think what brought me here. It seems as if I were in my study a minute ago, but I suppose I have been dreaming along for an hour, and have come all this stretch without noticing, for I am not myself in these troubled days." Then he went mumbling along to himself, and walked straight through Satan, just as if nothing were there. It made us catch our breath to see it. We had the impulse to cry out, the way you nearly always do when a startling thing happens, but something mysteriously restrained us, and we remained quiet, only breathing fast. Then the trees hid Father Peter after a little, and Satan said, "It is as I told you. I am only a spirit." "Yes, one perceives it now," said Nicholas, "but we are not spirits. It is plain he did not see you. But were we invisible too? He looked at us, but he didn't seem to see us." "No, none of us was visible to him, for I wished it so." It seemed almost too good to be true, that we were actually seeing these romantic and wonderful things, and that it was not a dream. And there he sat, looking just like anybody, so natural and simple and charming, and chatting along again the same as ever, and, well, words cannot make you understand what we felt. It was an ecstasy, and an ecstasy is a thing that will not go into words. It feels like music, and one cannot tell about music so that another person can get the feeling of it. He was back in the old ages once more now, and making them live before us. He had seen so much, so much. It was just a wonder to look at him and try to think how it must seem to have such experience behind one. But it made you seem sorrowfully trivial, and the creature of a day, And such a short and paltry day, too. And he didn't say anything to raise up your drooping pride. No, not a word. He always spoke of men in the same old indifferent way, just as one speaks of bricks and manure piles and such things. You could see that they were of no consequence to him, one way or the other. He didn't mean to hurt us, you could see that, just as we don't mean to insult a brick when we disparage it. A brick's emotions are nothing to us. It never occurs to us to think whether it has any or not. Once, when he was bunching the most illustrious kings and conquerors and poets and prophets and pirates and beggars together, just a brick pile, I was shamed into putting in a word for man, and asked him why he made so much difference between men and himself. He had to struggle with that a moment. He didn't seem to understand how I could ask such a strange question. Then he said, "The difference between man and me. The difference between a mortal and an immortal, between a cloud and a spirit." He picked up a woodlouse that was creeping along a piece of bark. "What is the difference between Caesar and this?" I said, "One cannot compare things which by their nature and by the interval between them are not comparable." "You have answered your own question," he said. "I will expand it. Man is made of dirt. I saw him made. I am not made of dirt. Man is a museum of diseases, a home of impurities. He comes today and is gone tomorrow. He begins as dirt and departs as stench. I am of the aristocracy of the imperishables. And man has the moral sense. You understand? He has the moral sense. That would seem to be difference enough between us all by itself." He stopped there, as if that settled the matter. I was sorry, for at that time I had but a dim idea of what the moral sense was. I merely knew that we were proud of having it. And when he talked like that about it, it wounded me, and I felt as a girl feels who thinks her dearest finery is being admired, and then overhears strangers making fun of it. For a while we were all silent, and I for one was depressed. Then Satan began to chat again, and soon he was sparkling along in such a cheerful and vivacious vein that my spirits rose once more. He told some very cunning things that put us in a gale of laughter, and when he was telling about the time that Samson tied the torches to the foxes' tails and set them loose in the Philistines' corn, and Samson sitting on the fence, slapping his thighs and laughing, with the tears running down his cheeks, and lost his balance and fell off the fence, the memory of that picture got him to laughing too, and we did have a most lovely and jolly time. By and by he said, "I am going on my errand now." "Don't," we all said. "Don't go. Stay with us. You won't come back." "Yes, I will. I give you my word." "When? Tonight? Say when." "It won't be long. You will see." "We like you." "And I you. And as a proof of it, I will show you something fine to see. Usually when I go I merely vanish. But now I will dissolve myself and let you see me do it." He stood up, and it was quickly finished. He thinned away and thinned away until he was a soap bubble, except that he kept his shape. You could see the bushes through him as clearly as you see things through a soap bubble, and all over him played and flashed the delicate, iridescent colors of the bubble, and along with them was that thing shaped like a window sash, which you always see on the globe of the bubble. You have seen a bubble strike the carpet and lightly bound along 2 or 3 times before it bursts. He did that. He sprang, touched the grass, bounded, floated along, touched again, and so on, and presently exploded. Poof! And in his place was vacancy. It was a strange and beautiful thing to see. We did not say anything, but sat wondering and dreaming and blinking. And finally Seppi roused up and said, mournfully sighing, "I suppose none of it has happened." Nicholas sighed and said about the same. I was miserable to hear them say it, for it was the same cold fear that was in my own mind. Then we saw poor old Father Peter wandering along back, with his head bent down, searching the ground. When he was pretty close to us, he looked up and saw us, and said, "How long have you been here, boys?" "A little while, Father." "Then it is since I came by, and maybe you can help me. Did you come up by the path?" "Yes, Father." "That is good. I came the same way. I have lost my wallet. There wasn't much in it, but very little is much to me, for it was all I had. I suppose you haven't seen anything of it?" "No, Father, but we will help you hunt." "That is what I was going to ask you." "Oh, why, here it is." We hadn't noticed it. Yet there it lay, right where Satan stood when he began to melt, if he did melt and it wasn't a delusion. Father Peter picked it up and looked very much surprised. "It is mine," he said, "but not the contents. This is fat. Mine was flat. Mine was light. This is heavy." He opened it. It was stuffed as full as it could hold with gold coins. He let us gaze our fill, and of course we did gaze, for we had never seen so much money at one time before. All our mouths came open to say, "Satan did it," but nothing came out. There it was, you see. We couldn't tell what Satan didn't want told. He had said so himself. "Boys, did you do this?" It made us laugh, and it made him laugh, too, as soon as he thought what a foolish question it was. "Who has been here?" Our mouths came open to answer, but stood so for a moment because we couldn't say "Nobody," for it wouldn't be true, and the right word didn't seem to come. And then I thought of the right one and said it. "Not a human being." "That is so," said the others, and let their mouths go shut. "It is not so," said Father Peter, and looked at us very severely. "I came by here a while ago, and there was no one here, but that is nothing. Someone has been here since. I don't mean to say that the person didn't pass here before you came, and I don't mean to say you saw him, but someone did pass, that I know. On your honor, you saw no one?" "Not a human being." "That is sufficient. I know you are telling me the truth." He began to count the money on the path, we on our knees eagerly helping to stack it in little piles. "It's 1,100 ducats odd," he said. "Oh dear, if it were only mine, and I need it so," and his voice broke and his lips quivered. "It is yours, sir," we all cried out at once. "Every heller." "No, it isn't mine. Only 4 ducats are mine. The rest—" He fell to dreaming, poor old soul, and caressed some of the coins in his hands, and forgot where he was, sitting there on his heels with his old gray head bare. It was pitiful to see. "No," he said, waking up, "it isn't mine. I can't account for it. I think some enemy. It must be a trap." Nicholas said, "Father Peter, with the exception of the astrologer, you haven't a real enemy in the village, nor Margaret either, and not even a half enemy that's rich enough to chance 1,100 ducats to do you a mean turn. I'll ask you if that's so or not." He couldn't get around that argument, and it cheered him up. "But it isn't mine, you see. It isn't mine in any case." He said it in a wistful way, like a person that wouldn't be sorry, but glad, if anybody would contradict him. "It is yours, Father Peter, and we are witness to it, aren't we, boys?" "Yes, we are, and we'll stand by it, too." "Bless your hearts, you almost persuade me, you do indeed. If I had only 100 odd ducats of it. The house is mortgaged for it, and we've no home for our heads if we don't pay tomorrow. And that 4 ducats is all we've got in the... It's yours, every bit of it, and you've got to take it. We are bail that it's all right, aren't we, Theodore? Aren't we, Seppi?" We two said yes, and Nicholas stuffed the money back into the shabby old wallet and made the owner take it. So he said he would use 200 of it, for his house was good enough security for that, and would put the rest at interest till the rightful owner came for it. and on our side we must sign a paper showing how he got the money, a paper to show to the villagers as proof that he had not got out of his troubles dishonestly. End chapter 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. The Mysterious Stranger by Mark Twain. Read for you by Ted Delorme in Fort Mill, South Carolina, during March 2008. Chapter 4 of The Mysterious Stranger by Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Mysterious Stranger and Other Stories, Chapter 4. It made immense talk next day when Father Peter paid Solomon Isaacs in gold, and left the rest of the money with him at interest. Also, there was a pleasant change. Many people called at the house to congratulate him, and a number of cool old friends became kind and friendly again. And to top all, Margaret was invited to a party. And there was no mystery. Father Peter told the whole circumstance just as it happened, and said he could not account for it, only it was the plain hand of Providence, so far as he could see. One or two shook their heads and said privately it looked more like the hand of Satan, and really that seemed a surprisingly good guess for ignorant people like that. Some came slyly buzzing around, and tried to coax us boys to come out and tell the truth, and promised they wouldn't ever tell, but only wanted to know for their own satisfaction, because the whole thing was so curious. They even wanted to buy the secret and pay money for it, and if we could have invented something that would answer, but we couldn't. We hadn't the ingenuity, so we had to let the chance go by, and it was a pity. We carried that secret around without any trouble, but the other one, the big one, the splendid one, burned the very vitals of us. It was so hot to get out, and we so hot to let it out and astonish people with it. But we had to keep it in. In fact, it kept itself in. Satan said it would, and it did. We went off every day and got to ourselves in the woods so that we could talk about Satan, and really that was the only subject we thought of or cared anything about. And day and night we watched for him and hoped he would come, and we got more and more impatient all the time. We hadn't any interest in the other boys any more, and wouldn't take part in their games and enterprises. They seemed so tame after Satan, and their doings so trifling and commonplace after his adventures in antiquity and the constellations, and his miracles and meltings and explosions and all that. During the first day we were in a state of anxiety on account of one thing, and we kept going to Father Peter's house on one pretext or another to keep track of it. That was the gold coin. We were afraid it would crumble and turn to dust like fairy money. If it did... But it didn't. At the end of the day no complaint had been made about it, so after that we were satisfied that it was real gold, and dropped the anxiety out of our minds. There was a question which we wanted to ask Father Peter, and finally we went there the second evening a little diffidently, after drawing straws, and I asked it as casually as I could, though it did not sound as casual as I wanted, because I didn't know how. What is the moral sense, sir? He looked down, surprised, over his great spectacles, and said, "Why, it is the faculty which enables us to distinguish good from evil." It threw some light, but not a glare, and I was a little disappointed, also to some degree embarrassed. He was waiting for me to go on, so in default of anything else to say, I asked, "Is it valuable?" "Valuable? Heavens, lad, it is the one thing that lifts man above the beasts that perish, and makes him heir to immortality." This did not remind me of anything further to say, so I got out, with the other boys, and we went away with that indefinite sense you have often had of being filled but not fatted. They wanted me to explain, but I was tired. We passed out through the parlor, and there was Margaret at the spinet, teaching Marie Luger. So one of the deserting pupils was back. and an influential one, too. The others would follow. Margaret jumped up and ran and thanked us again with tears in her eyes. This was the third time, for saving her and her uncle from being turned into the street. And we told her again we hadn't done it, but that was her way. She never could be grateful enough for anything a person did for her, so we let her have her say. And as we passed through the garden, there was Wilhelm Meidling, sitting there waiting, for it was getting toward the edge of the evening, and he would be asking Margaret to take a walk along the river with him when she was done with the lesson. He was a young lawyer, and succeeding fairly well in working his way along little by little. He was very fond of Margaret, and she of him. He had not deserted along with the others, but had stood his ground all through. His faithfulness was not lost on Margaret and her uncle. He hadn't so very much talent, but he was handsome and good, and these are a kind of talents themselves, and help along. He asked us how the lesson was getting along, and we told him it was about done. And maybe it was so. We didn't know anything about it, but we judged it would please him, and it did, and didn't cost us anything. End chapter 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. The Mysterious Stranger and Other Stories by Mark Twain, read for you by Ted Delorme in Fort Mill, South Carolina, during March 2008. Chapter 5 of The Mysterious Stranger by Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Mysterious Stranger by Mark Twain. Chapter 5. On the fourth day comes the astrologer from his crumbling old tower up the valley, where he had heard the news, I reckon. He had a private talk with us, and we told him what we could, for we were mightily in dread of him. He sat there studying and studying a while to himself. Then he asked, "How many ducats did you say?" 1107, sir. Then he said, as if he were talking to himself, "It is very singular. Yes, very strange. A curious coincidence." Then he began to ask questions, and went over the whole ground from the beginning, we answering. By and by he said, 1106 ducats. It is a large sum. 7, said Seppi, correcting him. Oh, 7, was it? Of course a ducat more or less isn't of consequence, but you said 1106 before. It would not have been safe for us to say he was mistaken, but we knew he was. Nicholas said, "We ask pardon for the mistake, but we meant to say 7. "Oh, it is no matter, lad. It was merely that I noticed the discrepancy. It is several days, and you cannot be expected to remember precisely. One is apt to be inexact when there is no particular circumstance to impress the count upon the memory." "But there was one, sir," said Seppi eagerly. "What was it, my son?" asked the astrologer indifferently. "First we all counted the piles of coin, each in turn, and all made it the same, 1106. But I had slipped one out for fun when the count began, and now I slipped it back and said, 'I think there is a mistake. There are 1107. Let us count again.' We did, and of course I was right. They were astonished. Then I told you how it came about." The astrologer asked us if this was so, and we said it was. "That settles it," he said. "I know the thief now. Lads, the money was stolen." Then he went away, leaving us very much troubled, and wondering what he could mean. In about an hour we found out, for by that time it was all over the village, that Father Peter had been arrested for stealing a great sum of money from the astrologer. Everybody's tongue was loose and going. Many said it was not in Father Peter's character and must be a mistake. But the others shook their heads and said misery and want could drive a suffering man to almost anything. About one detail there were no differences. All agreed that Father Peter's account of how the money came into his hands was just about unbelievable. It had such an impossible look. They said it might have come into the astrologer's hands in some such way, but into Father Peter's, never. Our characters began to suffer now. We were Father Peter's only witnesses. How much did he probably pay us to back up his fantastic tale? People talked that kind of talk to us pretty freely and frankly, and we were full of scoffings when we begged them to believe really we had told only the truth. Our parents were harder on us than anyone else. Our fathers said we were disgracing our families, and they commanded us to purge ourselves of our lie, and there was no limit to their anger when we continued to say we had spoken true. Our mothers cried over us and begged us to give back our bribe and get back our honest names and save our families from shame and come out and honorably confess. And at last we were so worried and harassed that we tried to tell the whole thing, Satan and all, but no, it wouldn't come out. We were hoping and longing all the time that Satan would come and help us out of our trouble, but there was no sign of him. Within an hour after the astrologer's talk with us, Father Peter was in prison, and the money sealed up and in the hands of the officers of the law. The money was in a bag, and Solomon Isaacs said he had not touched it since he had counted it. His oath was taken that it was the same money, and that the amount was 1,107 ducats. Father Peter claimed trial by the ecclesiastical court, but our other priest, Father Adolf, said an ecclesiastical court hadn't jurisdiction over a suspended priest. The bishop upheld him. That settled it. The case would go to trial in the civil court. The court would not sit for some time to come. Wilhelm Meidling would be Father Peter's lawyer, and do the best he could, of course, but he told us privately that a weak case on his side, and all the power and prejudice on the other, made the outlook bad. So Margaret's new happiness died a quick death. No friends came to condole with her, and none were expected. An unsigned note withdrew her invitation to the party. There would be no scholars to take lessons. How could she support herself? She could remain in the house, for the mortgage was paid off, though the government and not poor Solomon Isaacs had the mortgage money in its grip for the present. Old Ursula, who was cook, chambermaid, housekeeper, laundress, and everything else for Father Peter, and had been Margaret's nurse in earlier years, said God would provide. But she said that from habit, for she was a good Christian. She meant to help in the providing, to make sure if she could find a way. We boys wanted to go and see Margaret, and show friendliness for her, but our parents were afraid of offending the community and wouldn't let us. The astrologer was going around inflaming everybody against Father Peter, and saying he was an abandoned thief, and had stolen 1,107 gold ducats from him. He said he knew he was a thief from that fact, for it was exactly the sum he had lost, and which Father Peter pretended he had found. In the afternoon of the 4th day after the catastrophe, old Ursula appeared at our house, and asked for some washing to do, and begged my mother to keep this secret, to save Margaret's pride, who would stop this project if she found it out. Yet Margaret had not enough to eat, and was growing weak. Ursula was growing weak herself, and showed it, and she ate of the food that was offered her like a starving person, but could not be persuaded to carry any home, for Margaret would not eat charity food. She took some clothes down to the stream to wash them, but we saw from the window that handling the bat was too much for her strength, so she was called back, and a trifle of money offered her, which she was afraid to take lest Margaret should suspect. Then she took it, saying she would explain that she found it in the road. To keep it from being a lie and damning her soul, she got me to drop it while she watched. Then she went along by there and found it, and exclaimed with surprise and joy, and picked it up and went her way. Like the rest of the village, she could tell everyday lies fast enough, and without taking any precautions against fire and brimstone on their account. But this was a new kind of lie, and it had a dangerous look, because she hadn't had any practice in it. After a week's practice it wouldn't have given her any trouble. It is the way we are made. I was in trouble, for how would Margaret live? Ursula could not find a coin in the road every day, perhaps not even a second one. And I was ashamed, too, for not having been near Margaret, and she so in need of friends. But that was my parents' fault, not mine, and I couldn't help it. I was walking along the path, feeling very downhearted, when a most cheery and tingling freshening up sensation went rippling through me, and I was too glad for any words, for I knew by that sign that Satan was by. I had noticed it before. Next moment he was alongside of me, and I was telling him all my trouble, and what had been happening to Margaret and her uncle. While we were talking, we turned a curve and saw old Ursula resting in the shade of a tree, and she had a lean stray kitten in her lap and was petting it. I asked her where she got it, and she said it came out of the woods and followed her, and she said it probably hadn't any mother or any friends, and she was going to take it home and take care of it. Satan said, "I understand you are very poor. Why do you want to add another mouth to feed? Why don't you give it to some rich person?" Ursula bridled at this and said, "Perhaps you would like to have it. You must be rich, with your fine clothes and quality airs." Then she sniffed and said, "Give it to the rich, the idea! The rich don't care for anybody but themselves. It is only the poor that have feeling for the poor and help them. The poor and God. God will provide for this kitten." "What makes you think so?" Ursula's eyes snapped with anger. "Because I know it," she said. "Not a sparrow falls to the ground without his seeing it." "But it falls just the same. What good is seeing it fall?" Old Ursula's jaws worked, but she could not get any word out for the moment, she was so horrified. When she got her tongue, she stormed out, "Go about your business, you puppy, or I will take a stick to you." I could not speak, I was so scared. I knew that with his notions about the human race, Satan would consider it a matter of no consequence to strike her dead, there being plenty more. But my tongue stood still. I could give her no warning. But nothing happened. Satan remained tranquil and indifferent. I suppose he could not be insulted by Ursula any more than the king could be insulted by a tumble-bug. The old woman jumped to her feet when she made her remark, and did it as briskly as a young girl. It had been many years since she had done the like of that. That was Satan's influence. He was a fresh breeze to the weak and sick wherever he came. His presence affected even the lean kitten, and it skipped to the ground and began to chase a leaf. This surprised Ursula, and she stood looking at the creature and nodding her head wonderingly, her anger quite forgotten. "What's come over it?" she said. "A while ago it could hardly walk." "You have not seen a kitten of that breed before," said Satan. Ursula was not proposing to be friendly with the mocking stranger, and she gave him an ungentle look and retorted, "Who asked you to come here and pester me, I'd like to know? And what do you know about what I've seen and what I haven't seen?" "You haven't seen a kitten with the hair spines on its tongue pointing to the front, have you?" "No, nor you either." "Well, examine this one and see." Ursula was becoming pretty spry, but the kitten was spryer, and she could not catch it and had to give it up. Then Satan said, "Give it a name, and maybe it will come." Ursula tried several names, but the kitten was not interested. "Call it Agnes. Try that." The creature answered to the name and came. Ursula examined its tongue. "Upon my word, it's true," she said. "I have not seen this kind of a cat before. Is it yours?" "No." "Then how did you know its name so pat?" "Because all cats of that breed are named Agnes. They will not answer to any other." Ursula was impressed. "It is the most wonderful thing." Then a shadow of trouble came into her face, for her superstitions were aroused, and she reluctantly put the creature down, saying, "I suppose I must let it go. I am not afraid, no, not exactly that, though the priest Well, I've heard people, indeed many people, and besides, it is quite well now and can take care of itself." She sighed and turned to go, murmuring, "It is such a pretty one, too, and would be such company. And the house is so sad and lonesome these troubled days. Miss Margaret's so mournful and just a shadow, and the old master shut up in jail." "It seems a pity not to keep it," said Satan. Ursula turned quickly, just as if she were hoping someone would encourage her. "Why?" she asked wistfully. "Because this breed brings luck." "Does it? Is it true? Young man, do you know it to be true? How does it bring luck?" "Well, it brings money, anyway." Ursula looked disappointed. "Money? A cat bring money? The idea! You could never sell it here. People do not buy cats here. One can't even give them away." She turned to go. "I don't mean sell it. I mean have an income from it. This kind is called the lucky cat. Its owner finds 4 silver groschen in his pocket every morning." I saw the indignation rising in the old woman's face. She was insulted. This boy was making fun of her. That was her thought. She thrust her hands into her pockets and straightened up to give him a piece of her mind. Her temper was all up and hot. Her mouth came open and let out 3 words of a bitter sentence. Then it fell silent, and the anger in her face turned to surprise, or wonder, or fear, or something, and she slowly brought out her hands from her pockets and opened them and held them so. In one was my piece of money, in the other lay 4 silver groschen. She gazed a little while, perhaps to see if the groschen would vanish away. Then she said fervently, "It's true, it's true, and I'm ashamed and beg forgiveness, oh dear master and benefactor." And she ran to Satan and kissed his hand over and over again, according to the Austrian custom. In her heart she probably believed it was a witch cat and an agent of the devil. But no matter, it was all the more certain to be able to keep its contract and furnish a daily good living for the family, for in matters of finance even the piousest of our peasants would have more confidence in an arrangement with the devil than with an archangel. Ursula started homeward with Agnes in her arms, and I said I wished I had her privilege of seeing Margaret. Then I caught my breath, for we were there in the parlor, and Margaret standing looking at us astonished. She was feeble and pale, but I knew that those conditions would not last in Satan's atmosphere, and it turned out so. I introduced Satan, that is, Philip Trum, and we sat down and talked. There was no constraint. We were simple folk in our village, and when a stranger was a pleasant person we were soon friends. Margaret wondered how we got in without her hearing us. Trum said the door was open, and we walked in and waited until she would turn around and greet us. This was not true. No door was open. We entered through the walls or the roof or down the chimney or somehow, but no matter what Satan wished a person to believe, the person was sure to believe, and so Margaret was quite satisfied with that explanation. And then the main part of her mind was on Trum anyway. She couldn't keep her eyes off him. He was so beautiful. That gratified me and made me proud. I hoped he would show off some, but he didn't. He seemed only interested in being friendly and telling lies. He said he was an orphan. That made Margaret pity him. The water came into her eyes. He said he had never known his mamma. She passed away while he was a young thing, and said his papa was in shattered health and had no property to speak of, in fact none of any earthly value. But he had an uncle in business down in the tropics, and he was very well off and had a monopoly, and it was from this uncle that he drew his support. The very mention of a kind uncle was enough to remind Margaret of her own, and her eyes filled again. She said she hoped their 2 uncles would meet some day. It made me shudder. Philip said he hoped so too, and that made me shudder again. "Maybe they will," said Margaret. "Does your uncle travel much?" "Oh, yes. He goes all about. He has business everywhere." And so they went on chatting, and poor Margaret forgot her sorrow for one little while anyway. It was probably the only really bright and cheery hour she had known lately. I saw she liked Philip, and I knew she would. And when he told her he was studying for the ministry, I could see that she liked him better than ever. And then, when he promised to get her admitted to the jail so that she could see her uncle, that was the capstone. He said he would give the guards a little present, and she must always go in the evening after dark and say nothing, but just show this paper and pass in, and show it again when you come out. And he scribbled some queer marks on the paper and gave it to her, and she was ever so thankful, and right away was in a fever for the sun to go down. For in that old cruel time prisoners were not allowed to see their friends, and sometimes they spent years in the jails without ever seeing a friendly face. I judged that the marks on the paper were an enchantment, and that the guards would not know what they were doing, nor have any memory of it afterward, and that was indeed the way of it. Ursula put her head in at the door now and said, "Supper's ready, miss." Then she saw us and looked frightened, and motioned me to come to her, which I did, and she asked if we had told about the cat. I said no, and she was relieved and said, "Please don't, for if Miss Margaret knew, she would think it was an unholy cat, and would send for a priest and have its gifts all purified out of it, and then there wouldn't be any more dividends." So I said we wouldn't tell, and she was satisfied. Then I was beginning to say good-bye to Margaret, but Satan interrupted and said ever so politely, well, I don't remember just the words, but anyway he as good as invited himself to supper, and me too. Of course Margaret was miserably embarrassed, for she had no reason to suppose there would be half enough for a sick bird. Ursula heard him, and she came straight into the room, not a bit pleased. At first she was astonished to see Margaret looking so fresh and rosy, and said so. Then she spoke up in her native tongue, which was Bohemian, and said, as I learned afterward, "Send him away, Miss Margaret, there's not victuals enough." Before Margaret could speak, Satan had the word and was talking back to Ursula in her own language, which was a surprise to her, and for her mistress too. He said, "Didn't I see you down the road a while ago?" "Yes, sir." "Ah, that pleases me. I see you remember me." He stepped to her and whispered, "I told you it is a lucky cat. Don't be troubled. It will provide." That sponged the slate of Ursula's feelings clean of its anxieties, and a deep financial joy shone in her eyes. The cat's value was augmenting. It was getting full time for Margaret to take some sort of notice of Satan's invitation, and she did it in the best way, the honest way that was natural to her. She said she had little to offer, but that we were welcome if we would share it with her. We had supper in the kitchen, and Ursula waited at table. A small fish was in the frying pan, crisp and brown and tempting, and one could see that Margaret was not expecting such respectable food as this. Ursula brought it, and Margaret divided it between Satan and me, declining to take any of it herself, and was beginning to say she did not care for fish today, but she did not finish the remark. It was because she noticed that another fish had appeared in the pan. She looked surprised, but did not say anything. She probably meant to inquire of Ursula about this later. There were other surprises, flesh and game and wines and fruits, things which had been strangers in that house lately. But Margaret made no exclamations, and now even looked unsurprised, which was Satan's influence, of course. Satan talked right along and was entertaining and made the time pass pleasantly and cheerfully, and although he told a good many lies, it was no harm in him, for he was only an angel and did not know any better. They do not know right from wrong. I knew this because I remembered what he had said about it. He got on the good side of Ursula. He praised her to Margaret confidentially, but speaking just loud enough for Ursula to hear. He said she was a fine woman, and he hoped some day to bring her and his uncle together. Very soon Ursula was mincing and simpering around in a ridiculous girly way, and smoothing out her gown and prinking at herself like a foolish old hen, and all the time pretending she was not hearing what Satan was saying. I was ashamed, for it showed us to be what Satan considered us, a silly race and trivial. Satan said his uncle entertained a great deal, and to have a clever woman presiding over the festivities would double the attractions of the place. "But your uncle is a gentleman, isn't he?" asked Margaret. "Yes," said Satan indifferently. "Some even call him a prince out of compliment, but he is not bigoted. To him personal merit is everything, rank nothing." My hand was hanging down by my chair. Agnes came along and licked it. By this act a secret was revealed. I started to say, "It is all a mistake. This is just a common, ordinary cat. The hair needles on her tongue point inward, not outward." But the words did not come, because they couldn't. Satan smiled upon me, and I understood. When it was dark, Margaret took food and wine and fruit in a basket and hurried away to the jail, and Satan and I walked toward my home. I was thinking to myself that I should like to see what the inside of the jail was like. Satan overheard that thought, and the next moment we were in the jail. We were in the torture chamber, Satan said. The rack was there, and the other instruments, and there was a smoky lantern or two hanging on the walls and helping to make the place look dim and dreadful. There were people there, and executioners, but as they took no notice of us, it meant that we were invisible. A young man lay bound, and Satan said he was suspected of being a heretic, and the executioners were about to inquire into it. They asked the man to confess to the charge, and he said he could not, for it was not true. Then they drove splinter after splinter under his nails, and he shrieked with the pain. Satan was not disturbed, but I could not endure it, and had to be whisked out of there. I was faint and sick, but the fresh air revived me, and we walked toward my home. I said it was a brutal thing. No, it was a human thing. You should not insult the brutes by such a misuse of that word. They have not deserved it. And he went on talking like that. It is like your poultry race, always lying, always claiming virtues which it hasn't got, always denying them to the higher animals, which alone possess them. No brute ever does a cruel thing. That is a monopoly of those with the moral sense. When a brute inflicts pain, he does it innocently. It is not wrong. For him there is no such thing as wrong. And he does not inflict pain for the pleasure of inflicting it. Only man does that, inspired by that mongrel moral sense of his. A sense whose function is to distinguish between right and wrong, with liberty to choose which of them he will do. Now what advantage can he get out of that? He is always choosing, and in 9 cases out of 10 he prefers the wrong. There shouldn't be any wrong, and without the moral sense there couldn't be any. And yet he is such an unreasoning creature that he is not able to perceive that the moral sense degrades him to the bottom layer of animated beings, and is a shameful possession. Are you feeling better? Let me show you something. End chapter 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. The Mysterious Stranger by Mark Twain, read for you by Ted Delorme in Fort Mill, South Carolina, during March 2008. Chapter 6 of The Mysterious Stranger by Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Mysterious Stranger, Chapter 6. In a moment we were in a French village. We walked through a great factory of some sort, where men and women and little children were toiling in heat and dirt and a fog of dust, and they were clothed in rags and drooped at their work, for they were worn and half-starved and weak and drowsy. Satan said, "It is some more moral sense. The proprietors are rich and very holy, but the wage they pay to these poor brothers and sisters of theirs is only enough to keep them from dropping dead with hunger. The work hours are 14 per day, winter and summer, from 6 in the morning till 8 at night, little children and all. and they walk to and from the pigsties which they inhabit, 4 miles each way, through mud and slush, rain, snow, sleet, and storm, daily, year in and year out. They get 4 hours of sleep. They kennel together, 3 families in a room, in unimaginable filth and stench, and disease comes, and they die off like flies. Have they committed a crime, these mangy things? No. What have they done that they are punished so? Nothing at all, except getting themselves born into your foolish race. You have seen how they treat a misdoer there in the jail. Now you see how they treat the innocent and the worthy. Is your race logical? Are these ill-smelling innocents better off than that heretic? Indeed, no. His punishment is trivial compared with theirs. They broke him on the wheel and smashed him to rags and pulp after we left, and he is dead now, and free of your precious race. But these poor slaves here, why, they have been dying for years, and some of them will not escape from life for years to come. It is the moral sense which teaches the factory proprietors the difference between right and wrong. You perceive the result. They think themselves better than dogs. You are such an illogical, unreasoning race. And poultry. Oh, unspeakably. Then he dropped all seriousness, and just overstrained himself, making fun of us, and deriding our pride in our warlike deeds, our great heroes, our imperishable fames, our mighty kings, our ancient aristocracies, our venerable history, and laughed, till it was enough to make a person sick to hear him. And finally he sobered a little and said, "But, after all, it is not all ridiculous. There is a sort of pathos about it when one remembers how few are your days, how childish your pomps, and what shadows you are." Presently all things vanished suddenly from my sight, and I knew what it meant. The next moment we were walking along in our village, and down toward the river I saw the twinkling lights of the Golden Stag. Then in the dark I heard a joyful cry. "He's come again!" It was Seppi Wohlmeyer. He had felt his blood leap and his spirits rise in a way that could mean only one thing, and he knew Satan was near, although it was too dark to see him. He came to us, and we walked along together, and Seppi poured out his gladness like water. It was as if he were a lover and had found his sweetheart who had been lost. Seppi was a smart and animated boy, and had enthusiasm and expression, and was a contrast to Nicholas and me. He was full of the last new mystery now, the disappearance of Hans Uppert, the village loafer. People were beginning to be curious about it, he said. He did not say anxious. Curious was the right word, and strong enough. No one had seen Hans for a couple of days. "Not since he did that brutal thing, you know," he said. "What brutal thing?" It was Satan that asked. "Well, he is always clubbing his dog, which is a good dog, and his only friend, and is faithful and loves him, and does no one any harm. And 2 days ago he was at it again, just for nothing, just for pleasure, and the dog was howling and begging, and Theodore and I begged too. But he threatened us, and struck the dog again with all his might, and knocked one of his eyes out, and he said to us, 'There, I hope you are satisfied now. That's what you have got for him by your damned meddling.' And he laughed, the heartless brute." Seppi's voice trembled with pity and anger. I guessed what Satan would say, and he said it. There is that misused word again, that shabby slander. Brutes do not act like that, but only men. Well, it was inhuman anyway. No, it wasn't, Seppi. It was human, quite distinctly human. It is not pleasant to hear you libel the higher animals by attributing to them dispositions which they are free from, and which are found nowhere but in the human heart. None of the higher animals is tainted with the disease called the moral sense. Purify your language, Seppi. Drop those lying phrases out of it." He spoke pretty sternly for him, and I was sorry I hadn't warned Seppi to be more particular about the word he used. I knew how he was feeling. He would not want to offend Satan. He would rather offend all his kin. There was an uncomfortable silence. But relief soon came, for that poor dog came along now, with his eye hanging down, and went straight to Satan, and began to moan and mutter brokenly, and Satan began to answer in the same way, and it was plain that they were talking together in the dog language. We all sat down in the grass in the moonlight, for the clouds were breaking away now, and Satan took the dog's head in his lap and put the eye back in its place, and the dog was comfortable, and he wagged his tail and licked Satan's hand, and looked thankful, and said the same. I knew he was saying it, though I did not understand the words. Then the two talked together a bit, and Satan said, "He says his master was drunk." "Yes, he was," said we. "And an hour later he fell over the precipice there beyond the cliff pasture. We know the place. It is 3 miles from here. And the dog has been often to the village, begging people to go there, but he was only driven away and not listened to." We remembered it, but hadn't understood what he wanted. He only wanted help for the man who had misused him, and he thought only of that, and has had no food nor sought any. He has watched by his master 2 nights. What do you think of your race? Is heaven reserved for it, and this dog ruled out, as your teachers tell you? Can your race add anything to this dog's stock of morals and magnanimities? He spoke to the creature, who jumped up, eager and happy, and apparently ready for orders and impatient to execute them. "Get some men. Go with the dog. He will show you that carrion, and take a priest along to arrange about insurance, for death is near." With the last word he vanished, to our sorrow and disappointment. We got the men and Father Adolf, and we saw the man die. Nobody cared but the dog. He mourned and grieved, and licked the dead face, and could not be comforted. We buried him where he was, and without a coffin, for he had no money, and no friend but the dog. If we had been an hour earlier, the priest would have been in time to send that poor creature to heaven, but now he was gone down into the awful fires to burn forever. It seemed such a pity that, in a world where so many people have difficulty to put in their time, 1 little hour could not have been spared for this poor creature who needed it so much, and to whom it would have made the difference between eternal joy and eternal pain. It gave an appalling idea of the value of an hour, and I thought I could never waste one again without remorse and terror. Seppi was depressed and grieved, and said it must be so much better to be a dog and not run such awful risks. We took this one home with us, and kept him for our own. Seppi had a very good thought as we were walking along, and it cheered us up and made us feel much better. He said the dog had forgiven the man that had wronged him so, and maybe God would accept that absolution. There was a very dull week now, for Satan did not come. Nothing much was going on, and we boys could not venture to go and see Margaret, because the nights were moonlit and our parents might find us out if we tried. But we came across Ursula a couple of times, taking a walk in the meadows beyond the river to air the cat, and we learned from her that things were going well. She had natty new clothes on, and bore a prosperous look. The 4 groschen a day were arriving without a break, but were not being spent for food and wine and such things. The cat attended to all that. Margaret was enduring her forsakenness and isolation fairly well, all things considered, and was cheerful by help of Wilhelm Meidling. She spent an hour or 2 every night in the jail with her uncle, and had fattened him up with the cat's contributions. But she was curious to know more about Philip Traum, and hoped I would bring him again. Ursula was curious about him herself, and asked a good many questions about his uncle. It made the boys laugh, for I had told them the nonsense Satan had been stuffing her with. She got no satisfaction out of us, our tongues being tied. Ursula gave us a small item of information. Money being plenty now, she had taken on a servant to help about the house and run errands. She tried to tell it in a commonplace, matter-of-course way, but she was so set up by it and so vain of it that her pride in it leaked out pretty plainly. It was beautiful to see her veiled delight in this grandeur, poor old thing, but when we heard the name of the servant we wondered if she had been altogether wise. For although we were young and often thoughtless, we had fairly good perception on some matters. This boy was Gottfried Narr, a dull, good creature, with no harm in him and nothing against him personally. Still, he was under a cloud, and properly so, for it had not been 6 months since a social blight had mildewed the family. His grandmother had been burned as a witch. When that kind of malady is in the blood, it does not always come out with just one burning. Just now was not a good time for Ursula and Margaret to be having dealings with a member of such a family, for the witch terror had risen higher during the past year than it had ever reached in the memory of the oldest villagers. The mere mention of a witch was almost enough to frighten us out of our wits. This was natural enough, because of late years there were more kinds of witches than there used to be. In old times it had been only old women, but of late they were of all ages, even children of 8 and 9. It was getting so that anybody might turn out to be a familiar of the devil. Age and sex hadn't anything to do with it. In our little region we had tried to extirpate the witches, but the more of them we burned, the more of the breed rose up in their places. Once, in a school for girls only 10 miles away, the teachers found that the back of one of the girls was all red and inflamed, and they were greatly frightened, believing it to be the devil's marks. The girl was scared and begged them not to denounce her, and said it was only fleas, but of course it would not do to let the matter rest there. All the girls were examined, and 11 out of the 50 were badly marked, the rest less so. A commission was appointed, but the 11 only cried for their mothers and would not confess. Then they were shut up, each by herself, in the dark, and put on black bread and water for 10 days and nights, and by that time they were haggard and wild, and their eyes were dry, and they did not cry any more, but only sat and mumbled, and would not take the food. Then one of them confessed, and said they had often ridden through the air on broomsticks to the witches' Sabbath, and in a bleak place high up in the mountains had danced and drunk and caroused with several hundred other witches and the evil one, and all had conducted themselves in a scandalous way, and had reviled the priests and blasphemed God. That is what she said. Not in narrative form, for she was not able to remember any of the details without having them called to her mind one after the other, but the commission did that, for they knew just what questions to ask, they being all written down for the use of witch commissioners 2 centuries before. They asked, "Did you do so and so?" And she always said yes, and looked weary and tired, and took no interest in it. And so when the other 10 heard that this one confessed, they confessed too, and answered yes to the questions. Then they were burned at the stake all together, which was just and right, and everybody went from all the countryside to see it. I went too, and when I saw that one of them was a bonny, sweet girl I used to play with, and looked so pitiful there, chained to the stake, and her mother crying over her, and devouring her with kisses, and clinging around her neck, and saying, "Oh, my God, oh, my God!" It was too dreadful, and I went away. It was bitter cold weather when Gottfried's grandmother was burned. It was charged that she had cured bad headaches by kneading the person's head and neck with her fingers, as she said, but really by the devil's help, as everybody knew. They were going to examine her, but she stopped them and confessed straight off that her power was from the devil. So they appointed to burn her next morning, early, in our market square. The officer who was to prepare the fire was there first, and prepared it. She was there next, brought by the constables, who left her and went to fetch another witch. Her family did not come with her. They might be reviled, maybe stoned, if the people were excited. I came and gave her an apple. She was squatting at the fire, warming herself and waiting, and her old lips and hands were blue with the cold. A stranger came next. He was a traveler passing through, and he spoke to her gently, and seeing nobody but me there to hear, said he was sorry for her. And he asked if what she confessed was true, and she said no. He looked surprised and still more sorry then, and asked her, "Then why did you confess?" "I am old and very poor," she said, "and I work for my living. There was no way but to confess. If I hadn't, they might have set me free. That would ruin me, for no one would forget that I had been suspected of being a witch, and so I would get no more work, and wherever I went they would set the dogs on me. In a little while I would starve. The fire is best. It is soon over. You have been good to me, you two, and I thank you." She snuggled closer to the fire and put out her hands to warm them, the snowflakes descending soft and still on her old gray head and making it white and whiter. The crowd was gathering now, and an egg came flying and struck her in the eye, and broke and ran down her face. There was a laugh at that. I told Satan all about the 11 girls and the old woman once, but it did not affect him. He only said it was the human race, and what the human race did was of no consequence. And he said he had seen it made, and it was not made of clay. It was made of mud. Part of it was, anyway. I knew what he meant by that. The moral sense. He saw the thought in my head, and it tickled him and made him laugh. Then he called a bullock out of a pasture, and petted it, and talked with it, and said, "There, he wouldn't drive children mad with hunger and fright and loneliness, and then burn them for confessing to things invented for them, which had never happened. And neither would he break the hearts of innocent poor old women, and make them afraid to trust themselves among their own race. And he would not insult them in their death agony. For he is not besmirched with the moral sense, but is as the angels are, and knows no wrong, and never does it." Lovely as he was, Satan could be cruelly offensive when he chose, and he always chose when the human race was brought to his attention. He always turned up his nose at it, and never had a kind word for it. Well, as I was saying, we boys doubted if it was a good time for Ursula to be hiring a member of the Nar family. We were right. When the people found it out, they were naturally indignant, and moreover, since Margaret and Ursula hadn't enough to eat themselves, where was the money coming from to feed another mouth? That is what they wanted to know, and in order to find out, they stopped avoiding Gottfried and began to seek his society and have sociable conversations with him. He was pleased, not thinking any harm and not seeing the trap, and so he talked innocently along and was no discreeter than a cow. "Money," he said, "they've got plenty of it. They pay me 2 groschen a week besides my keep, and they live on the fat of the land. I can tell you, the prince himself can't beat their table." This astonishing statement was conveyed by the astrologer to Father Adolf on a Sunday morning when he was returning from Mass. He was deeply moved and said, "This must be looked into." He said there must be witchcraft at the bottom of it, and told the villagers to resume relations with Margaret and Ursula in a private and unostentatious way, and keep both eyes open. They were told to keep their own counsel and not rouse the suspicions of the household. The villagers were at first a bit reluctant to enter such a dreadful place, but the priest said they would be under his protection while there, and no harm could come to them, particularly if they carried a trifle of holy water along, and kept their beads and crosses handy. This satisfied them, and made them willing to go. Envy and malice made the baser sort even eager to go. And so poor Margaret began to have company again, and was as pleased as a cat. She was like most anybody else, just human and happy in her prosperities, and not averse from showing them off a little. And she was humanly grateful to have the warm shoulder turned to her, and be smiled upon by her friends and the village again. For of all the hard things to bear, to be cut by your neighbors and left in contemptuous solitude is maybe the hardest. The bars were down, and we could all go there now. And we did, our parents and all, day after day. The cat began to strain herself. She provided the top of everything for those companies, and in abundance, among them many a dish and many a wine which they had not tasted before, and which they had not even heard of except at second hand from the prince's servants, and the tableware was much above ordinary too. Margaret was troubled at times, and pursued Ursula with questions to an uncomfortable degree. But Ursula stood her ground and stuck to it that it was Providence, and said no word about the cat. Margaret knew that nothing was impossible to Providence, but she could not help having doubts that this effort was from there, though she was afraid to say so lest disaster come of it. Witchcraft occurred to her, but she put the thought aside, for this was before Gottfried joined the household, and she knew Ursula was pious and a bitter hater of witches. By the time Gottfried arrived, Providence was established, unshakably entrenched, and getting all the gratitude. The cat made no murmur, but went on composedly improving in style and prodigality by experience. In any community, big or little, there is always a fair proportion of people who are not malicious or unkind by nature, and who never do unkind things, except when they are overmastered by fear, or when their self-interest is greatly in danger, or some such matter as that. Esseldorf had its proportion of such people, and ordinarily their good and gentle influence was felt. But these were not ordinary times, on account of the witch dread, and so we did not seem to have any gentle and compassionate hearts left to speak of. Every person was frightened at the unaccountable state of things at Margaret's house, not doubting that witchcraft was at the bottom of it, and fright frenzied their reason. Naturally, there were some who pitied Margaret and Ursula for the danger that was gathering about them, but naturally they did not say so. It would not have been safe. So the others had it all their own way, and there was none to advise the ignorant girl and the foolish woman, and warn them to modify their doings. We boys wanted to warn them, but we backed down when it came to the pinch, being afraid. We found that we were not manly enough nor brave enough to do a generous action when there was a chance that it could get us into trouble. Neither of us confessed this poor spirit to the others, but did as other people would have done, dropped the subject and talked about something else. And I knew we all felt mean, eating and drinking Margaret's fine things along with those companies of spies, and petting her and complimenting her with the rest, and seeing with self-reproach how foolishly happy she was, and never saying a word to put her on guard. And indeed she was happy, and as proud as a princess, and so grateful to have friends again. And all the time these people were watching with all their eyes, and reporting all they saw to Father Adolf. But he couldn't make head or tail of the situation. There must be an enchanter somewhere on the premises, but who was it? Margaret was not seen to do any jugglery, nor was Ursula, nor yet Gottfried. And still the wines and dainties never ran short, and a guest could not call for a thing and not get it. To produce these effects was unusual enough with witches and enchanters. That part of it was not new. But to do it without any incantations, or even any rumblings or earthquakes or lightnings or apparitions, that was new, novel, wholly irregular. There was nothing in the books like this. Enchanted things were always unreal. Gold turned to dirt in an unenchanted atmosphere. Food withered away and vanished. But this test failed in the present case. The spies brought samples. Father Adolf prayed over them, exorcised them, but it did no good. They remained sound and real. They yielded to natural decay only, and took the usual time to do it. Father Adolf was not merely puzzled, he was also exasperated, for these evidences very nearly convinced him privately that there was no witchcraft in the matter. It did not wholly convince him, for this could be a new kind of witchcraft. There was a way to find out as to this. If this prodigal abundance of provender was not brought in from the outside, but produced on the premises, there was witchcraft sure. End chapter 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. The Mysterious Stranger by Mark Twain, read for you by Ted Delorme in Fort Mill, South Carolina, during March 2008.